And good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
You know, we're so pleased to be with you this morning. I always am in awe when we get an invitation to serve a church we've never been to before. And, you know, as our chairperson said this morning, hopefully we'll say some words that reach your hearts, but that's not my job. My job is to reach your minds and probably test your understanding of this thing we call spiritualism. You know, I know I'm not under any illusion that some of you here and many church services we go to, most of the congregation is sitting waiting for this young lady, putting up with what I have to say to get to her. They commonly call it the message service. The medium gives the message. Well, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you all this morning. She's not going to give you any messages. That's my job. The job of the speaker in the spiritualist divine service is to give the message. Her job is to provide you with some information, pieces of information that proves beyond a reasonable doubt to some particular individuals in this room, and if the evidence and the information is sufficient enough, it will impress all of you in this room. Her job is to prove the existence of spirit, that life goes on. My job is to give you the message. And what is the great message of spiritualism? Well, it's commonly said, there is no death. That could be disputed, because everything dies. Everything has a beginning. Everything has an end. It could be argued that that is the same as spirit. But we won't get into that. That's a philosophical discussion for another day. But it does take you to the question of, why are we all here? Why are we spiritualists? Or why do we call ourselves spiritualists? Or why are we searching to become spiritualists? Well, that goes back a few years, that question. What is a spiritualist? You know, one of our early pioneers was a fellow by the name of Hudson Tuttle. He was from Ohio. He had a bit of an accent. He was from southern Ohio. But he was a very knowledgeable, one of those early proponents of spiritualism, great writer. Somebody asked him that question one day, Hudson, what's a spiritualist? He said, well, it could be said that anyone who believes that departed spirits communicate with man or mortals, however else they disagree, are spiritualists. What better explanation? You know, in that context, however, you can be a Christian spiritualist, an Islamic spiritualist, a Buddhist spiritualist, a Catholic spiritualist, a Protestant spiritualist. Doesn't matter. If you believe that departed spirits can communicate with man, then you are a spiritualist. Now think about that for a while. Is that all there is? Well, Hudson was a little more coy than that. He says, but, he added a caveat, but it is only as you develop your noble faculties and harmonize your lives are you entitled to the term in its highest meaning. Now think about that. That puts a little different spin on communicating with spirit, because it goes back to the essence of spiritualism, why we call ourselves spiritualists, why we're here. And that goes back to three basic words that we commonly describe spiritualism as: a philosophy, a science, and a religion. Well, how do we get to those points? You know, most people think that our philosophical context came from the world of spirit. You know, through communication given by spirit over the years, red cloud, silver birch, individual opinions and interpretations of the words that have been received. But I would offer this opinion to test your understanding of our philosophy, that it goes back to a young boy. But it goes back even a little farther. Back in the 1700s, a fellow by the name of Emanuel Swedenborg, and I'm quite sure many of you have heard his name. He was a Swedish scientist, a diplomat, an inventor, an engineer, who late in life became interested in the life hereafter. And he developed this capacity to take his mind to the spiritual universe. And he visited that over a period of time. Don't forget, this was later years. He was into his mid-50s before he became interested in this. And he visited this spiritual universe, and he wrote a book on it, what he had learned there. He claimed to have actually talked to spirits, and they gave him piles of information. He wrote it in a book called Heaven and Hell, which introduced us for the very first time in modern times, in a formal context, a logical context, the existence of a spiritual universe, and that people actually lived there. And the people that lived there, the minds that lived there, were former residents of this planet. And he explained life there. And he gave two basic lessons to what was to occur later. Everything had a corresponding principle in both universes, the spiritual universe and the physical universe, the world we live in. Everything had a corresponding principle between the two. And aside from that, he established what we call the doctrine of influx, that there was a divine influx that came down through that spiritual universe into the physical universe. It permeated everything. The very first introduction we had to the spiritual universe, and that minds actually lived there. 100 years after that, something else happened. To confirm what Emmanuel had learned, there was a young boy, lived in the Hudson Valley of Upper New York State. His name was Andrew Jackson Davis. And I'm quite sure we're all familiar with that name if you're a spiritualist. 19 years of age. Now this boy had been hearing voices since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. Didn't understand what they were all about. And I won't go into an explanation of how he got to this particular point. But in November of 1847, he did exactly the same thing that Emmanuel did. He visited the spiritual universe. And he was told by two voices that had accompanied him since he was a boy. One was Emanuel Swedenborg, by the way, and the second was a Greek physician by the name of Claudius Galenus, who lived in the 2nd century. And they'd been with him since he was a boy. And they said, Jackson, and that's what he was known as, not Andy or Andrew, Jackson was his name. They said, Jackson, we want you to do something different. We want you to sit down. We want you to be placed into a trance condition, and we're going to take you to the spiritual universe. And they did that. And they said, we want you to do this publicly. We want you to advertise it. And they did. It was open to the public. New York City, from November 1847 to November of 1845 to March of 1847, he sat for 157 different sessions in what we call a trance condition, a state of altered consciousness. And he visited the spiritual universe, each session lasting 3 to 4 hours. And he described what he saw there. He didn't talk to anybody, he just described what he saw there. And he went back to the beginning of time and explained how everything happened, how our universe happened, how our solar system was formed within in the universe, how our planet was formed, how life evolved on our planet in detailed scientific terms. Evolving to the highest form of existence on our planet, the human form, moving from gas, electricity, liquid, through the geological formations, through the vegetation, through the formation of the animal kingdom, it was called, to the formation of the human form, the highest form of existence in this planet. He astounded the scientific community of the day because it was in detailed scientific terms. He published this book after it was translated into a book 12 years before Charles Darwin developed the theory of natural selection. 12 years before. This boy was 19 years old. He was illiterate. And yet these words came out of his mouth, describing everything in existence. But he went on from the human form to explain something that went beyond our existence. That when the human form dies, it moves on to the spiritual universe, the one described by Emanuel Swedenborg. And these sessions were eventually published into a book called The Principles of Nature, Her Divine Revelations, and A Voice to Mankind. And there's 33 pages in that book that defines the spiritual universe in minute detail. How we get there, how the dying process takes place on this earth, where we end up on in that scheme of things, the societies that exist there, explained it in detail, and that we all go through this process. And he gave to the spiritualist movement some additional principles to that which Emmanuel gave. One was that the duality of all things, that everything in existence had a material side and a spiritual side. Everything, without exception. But the human form was an extension of that. There was a trinity of the human form. The material body, a spiritual body, best described, I guess, as our sensations, our sense of taste, smell, sight, hearing, which was a holding mechanism for the spirit. And the spirit was simply our mind, our intelligence, our ability to reason, our ability to reach conclusions, which separated it from everything else in existence. And when that physical side dies, it moves on to this other side. We call it the spirit world. I think it's too limiting. It's a spiritual universe. And surprisingly, what we take with us there is all our imperfections. We're exactly the same there as we are here. Except the physical imperfection disappeared because we moved to a mental state. But we're exactly the same. All our mental problems, all our understanding of things, all our prejudices, we take with us. The message to us all, are we satisfied with that? If we're going to end up there exactly as we are here, are we satisfied with that? That's a question you have to ask yourself. And now is the time that you have an opportunity to do something about it. Because the end game in this, and I've been convinced of this for many, many years now, there's one word that joins every single human being on the face of this earth together. One word. One goal that we're all trying to achieve. And that word is happiness. The goal of the Spirit is to achieve a personal level of happiness. Think about it. What are we all looking for? Happiness. That's all we go. We go to work to find happiness. We communicate with our friends to find a measure of happiness. Think about that. When's the last time you really felt that inner sense of bliss? I hate to use that word, but it's the best way to describe it. When somebody probably said to you, I really want to thank you for looking after my mother when she was so ill and I had to go away. How did that make you feel? We've all had that experience at some point in time. It's just that inner level of satisfaction, of joy, of bliss. The search for happiness. The essence of our philosophy. Not point number one, philosophy. How do we get to that scientific thing then? Well, it took a couple of young teenagers, in addition to Andrew Jackson Davis, to solve that problem for us. Because in this book that was transcribed from his words, he predicted there will ere long come a day when the minds of men will be opened and spiritual communion will be established between the spiritual universe and the physical universe. And after that book was published, a year later, in 1848, on March 31st, two young girls in Hyattsville, New York, by the name of Katerina and Margarita Fox, established communication with the spirit of one Charles B. Rosman, who had been murdered in their little house 5 years previously. The science of spiritualism, the ability to communicate with those that live in a different dimension. Those two young girls gave us a form of mediumship as we know it today. Communication with spirit. Proving what Andrew Jackson Davis had said. That takes us to the third point. Why we're all here today. Religion. Religion. Think about that. How did the concept of spiritualism as a religion evolve? Well, most people say, well, it just happened. Well, it sort of, but not quite. Because spiritualists in the early days weren't religious. They were free thinkers. Don't tell me what to do. I'm a spiritualist. I'm a free thinker. I know that it's individual responsibility. I know that it's individual control and accountability. And what does that lead us to? In the early days, spiritualism was a movement for social justice. Justice denied one of us is justice denied every one of us. If you wanted to protest something, call a spiritualist. He'd put out a sandwich board and walk down Main Street. They railed against the slavery movement, child labor rights, women's rights, voting rights. Call a spiritualist, he'd be there, or she would be there. Most likely she would be there. It was a movement for social justice. It wasn't until 23 years after Hyattsville that an event happened in New York City. January 26th. Cold night in Manhattan, where one of the original Fox sisters was now living. Leah Underhill was her name at the time. She had married a New Yorker by that name. She wasn't in the cottage when communication was established, but she did protect her sisters after that, became an ardent spiritualist. In her home on that evening, there was what was held a circle. Some people call it a seance. I don't like that word. It's spooky. Television picks it up, movies pick it up, and they do it to service. It was a circle of spiritualists who gathered to try and communicate with those that live on the other side. The lead medium of that circle was a woman called Emma Harding Britton, an English woman who had moved to New York to seek her fame in Broadway, failed miserably, but met a medium and became a medium herself and became deeply involved in spiritualism. And one of the reasons we sit here today is because of her influence on the movement. She was one of the great propagandists for spiritualism. But she was the lead medium that night. And a personality came through. A fellow by the name of Robert Owen, who was a British industrialist who had lived and died before this circle occurred. But he had come to the U.S. with his son, Robert Dale Owen, to investigate this thing called spiritualism. What's it all about? Because it was just getting started, moving from the U.S. to the U.K. He didn't like what he saw. He went back. His son stayed. But strangely enough, his personality came through at that circle and gave to the spiritualist movement a set of words. Gave to the world in general a set of words. The fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, the immortality of the soul and its personal characteristics, proven communion between departed spirits and mortals, personal responsibility with compensation and retribution hereafter for all the good or evil deeds done on earth, and a path of eternal progress open to every human soul who wills to tread it by the path of eternal good. What I classify as the original principles of spiritualism, because the spiritualists of the day grabbed onto them. It gave them a common purpose. But before I get on to that, why would this man come to a circle in New York City after he lived his whole life in England, died in England, and appeared at this circle in New York City on January 26, 1871, because his son was in that circle, Robert Dale Owen. Spirit does not just show up. They have to have a reason. Lesson number one. But spiritualists grabbed onto it, and they started to organize. It gave them a common purpose. They could buy into this. And then all of a sudden, churches started to appear. Massachusetts, one springs up. One springs up in Ohio. One springs up in New York. And all of a sudden, it evolved into a religion. And it's been downhill ever since. Think about that. At one point in time, in those days, in the 1800s, particularly after the Civil War, the population of the United States was 30 million people. Depending upon whose statistic you buy into, anywhere between 3 and 10 million people claim to be spiritualists. Think about that. Slippery slope. We are where we are. But the three pinnings of spiritualism: the philosophy, the science, and the religion, all hinging on one thing: a search for a personal level of happiness. Never forget that. I cannot convince you of that. Only you can convince yourself of that. My job is to give you the message. Her job is to prove what I have said has some credibility. Thank you.